Hello and welcome to How Do You Feel? I'm Alannah Wesley, your host and moderator, and I'm also the founder of Immersive Futures, the thought leadership event and content series. So for everybody that's new today to How Do You Feel, we're on a mission to inspire global empathy, connecting audiences around the world at a time when we've all been physically divided. And as part of this, we decided to host this series of talks where each week we're inviting different business leaders to join us and to share how they've been navigating the pandemic and also what their business is doing in response. So for everyone who missed it, last week we were joined by one of the world's leading fintech entrepreneurs who shared how technology is positively disrupting the world of commerce and also how this is going to lead the influence business as we move forward into the future. Today we're going to be joined by Facebook, so the focus is going to be more on marketeers and brands and how we can really change the game up as we move forward. But we'll also be looking at social media and how the role of that has been really much more influential during the lockdown period and how this is going to evolve as we move forward. So at How Do You Feel, we very much believe that a key to unlocking insights about the pandemic is the study of human behaviour and psychology. And so every week we'll be sharing new highlights and insights about how everyday people around the world are feeling, which they've been sharing on howdoyoufeel.live. So before we get started, I'm just going to say a few thank yous. Firstly, to the teams that helped produce today's talks. So Really Creative Media from Virtual Stage and the production family. And secondly, to the Sympler team who launched howdoyoufeel.live. This session is about 40 minutes long and it's designed to be interactive throughout. So I ask you to keep submitting your questions throughout. And then Harry from the team at Sympler will be invited to share your questions at various moments. Right, so I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is the Director of Planning from Facebook. His name is Ian Edwards. Ian was actually the first ever planner to be hired at Facebook. And before that, he worked as the head of strategy for some of London's largest agencies around the world. Ian's also a contributor to AdMap and the Huffington Post. Welcome to you, Ian.
Hi there. Really good to be with you today. Looking forward to the discussion. Thanks
for joining us. And then our next guest is our resident speaker who joins us every week, Ben Jenkins. Ben is the founder of Sympler and howdoyoufeel.live. Ben is a brand strategist and ethnographer, and he spent his career studying youth culture and technology and where the two intersect. So welcome back, Ben.
Hello, morning.
Morning. Yes, Ben's in New York and Ian and I are in the United Kingdom. So for the first part of today, we're going to get a bit more of a feel for what Ian and Ben have been up to in business and how they're feeling about the pandemic. And I'm going to start with my first question with you, Ian. So you're homeschooling. You're also running a division of Facebook in the UK who are all working from home right now. And we've heard that Zuckerberg's announced that in the US, about 95% of employees are going to be working from home until at least Jan 2021. So this is kind of a big fundamental shift in Facebook's business. So can you kind of tell us what the reality of leading a business like Facebook has been like for you during the pandemic and kind of how your team are adapting and what you're learning?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think, I feel incredibly fortunate to work at a company like Facebook where, before we went into this, we were very well set up to work remotely. We've got multiple offices around the world. So we're quite used to kind of having to work, remotely and connecting with different teams. I think, it's not been without its challenges though. From a personal perspective, juggling homeschooling, it's half term this week, which is like just fantastic because there's no Zoom lessons to jump on. So that's been a bit of a break, but that has been a real challenge. And I think from a personal point of view, you have to be much more purposeful with your time. You have to really structure your day to get the kind of most out of it. Work out when you're going to do those important meetings, when you're with the kids. And also, I think for me personally, having boundaries around the day is important because, getting on the train in the morning to go into the office is a natural transition from your home life to your work life. And not having that commute coming back. I think when this all first started, I found myself, just jumping on calls and things like that late at night and working late at night. So you do have to be much more purposeful and structured, I think, with your time in lockdown. And I think from a work point of view, the team, I'm part of the UK leadership team and we have a fantastic team. And I think the key for us has been, really regular check-ins and communication. And I think, I guess a couple of bits that are important is when you're doing these Zoom calls, not everyone feels as comfortable talking on them. So, inclusion has been a really important part of what we've been thinking about, making sure that everyone who's joining a meeting, you're checking in with people and it's not just down to people who feel really comfortable speaking in this environment. And I think from a work, us delivering work, working with clients, actually, it was disruptive to start with. I think, even though, we talk about sort of, working in digital and remote connections, we have been quite reliant as an industry on person-to-person meetings. We've all got offices in the West End of London, so it's it is part of our culture to get together physically and talk in meetings. So we've had to learn to change that a little bit. But actually, what I found is that it's a lot easier to get a lot more people together when you don't have to commute from one location to another, and the appetite for sort of learning and these kind of sessions, but other sessions as well. We've had, scale that we've not seen before. So we run a weekly insights webinar, and we've had 15,000 people join that over the last, 8 weeks or so.
Wow.
Which which has been fantastic, and an opportunity to kind of talk and learn together. So yeah, there's been a bit of a pivot, but, overall, we're, very fortunate to be so well set up to work remotely and work in this kind of new normal, whatever that is.
Realizing how fortunate we are and not everybody's in the same situation is also a really kind of big revelation for many of us, and remembering that as we try and adapt, and then kind of seeing how other people are trying to adapt as well. So, you hear about, outside of the world of work, families who have one phone, and, everyone's trying to do their homework through this one phone or one laptop, and how schools are trying to manage that. So I think there's a lot of interesting insights there and that people can relate to. And building on that, Ben, physical distancing, not social distancing, is kind of what the current situation demands. Many of us are in fact more kind of socially connected than ever before, I'd say. So whether that be through technology or just closer to our communities. So kind of what psychological impact do you think this physical distance is having and going to have upon society? And kind of how are you at Sympler, your team, starting to kind of rethink space, both physical and online, and human interaction as a business? I think Ian touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, to be honest, that's one of the main reasons we created How Do You Feel in the first place. And it's a big part of what we're learning from the conversations that we're having, so which we'll talk about in section 2. But at a top line, there's some pretty significant changes. So one is that, people are more physically distant, but the depth of conversations is actually changing. And to some extent, it's getting stronger, especially in the more one-to-one mediums. We've got time, we're not sort of pressured from different sides as much. So, we've been studying private chat for research for a number of years. So things like Facebook Messenger, Snapchat, Instagram, DMs. And we'd already started to see the power of one-to-one to connect people more deeply, as opposed to social media, which is, you're kind of talking to a sort of blank screen to a certain extent. But what we're seeing in the pandemic is something similar, where people are getting deeper and more intimate, but at a larger scale. So, a bunch of people who'd never been on chat messaging, suddenly sort of crawled out of the woodwork because they now have to be. And I think what you're seeing when you compare it to regular social media, where you're forced to perform a little bit more, you sort of preen yourself and project a perfect image. When in messaging media, it allows you to put forward a more truthful, even more vulnerable self. And that words like that are coming out a lot more at the moment. So when social distancing took hold, more people who weren't used to it started using it. And because you don't really need to dress up, you need to brush your hair, put your trousers on. And I think what you're seeing is a lot more people being more present, spending more time, focusing on one person, one thing, because they're not being pulled in multiple directions. And I can see Ian grinning there at the trouser comment. I mean, which clearly tells me about what he's doing at the moment.
Thank you for that, Ben. So Ian, final question for this section, and then we'll move on to some audience questions. So in terms of Facebook and the communities there, or the individuals, since lockdown happened, have there been any kind of dramatic shifts in the way people are engaging with Facebook? I'd like to hear kind of what you've learned there, but also some of us have seen some campaigns that Facebook have launched in response to COVID. I'd love to hear a bit about the purpose of those campaigns and the impact that they've had so far.
Yeah, I feel like I should address the trouser point first. I'm definitely wearing trousers, just so we're clear on that, Ben. Thanks. Thanks for that. The transformation that we have seen in terms of how people are using our products and services has been the biggest shift I think that we've ever seen at the company. I think our biggest day usually across the year is New Year's Eve. And we've seen kind of New Year's Eve level of usage every single day as we've gone through lockdown. And, it's not surprising. It's kind of, Facebook was built to bring people together at a distance, so, we can fulfill a need that people have at the moment. And, there been sort of a growth in just people using the service. We've hit 3 billion people used our products globally for the first time in April. But what I think is really interesting is actually we've seen the growth of a lot of the standard uses. So things like messaging has doubled, and people are using Facebook and Instagram more. We saw 70% increase in time spent in Italy. But what's also really interesting is that I think people are having more meaningful social connection at the moment. So we've seen a huge rise in video and voice calling. Who knew people still want to speak to each other on the phone? So video and voice calling, there's been, that's doubled. And then other bits within that. So in Messenger, clearly video sort of conferencing or video meeting has been a big part of this shift. And, we've launched Messenger Rooms, which will roll out across WhatsApp and Instagram as well. But that allows up to 50 people to kind of get together. Lots of different functionality in there to try and improve that experience and allow people to connect, via video in larger groups. And then the other big area that we've seen that's changed is around live. So I'm sure we've all seen like your Instagram feed just lit up by people kind of going live, and we've seen a doubling in that. So we've tried to innovate around that product as well. Live, I think, has been a really important part for, the entertainment industry, people going live from events. So we've had to try and help that industry sort of pivot and create events around live, people going live. We brought back a feature that we'd taken away, so you could go live with other people and go live collectively to create a more of a sense of an event and bringing those people together. So that's been really interesting to see. And I think actually, one of the studies I saw the other week was fascinating, and it was saying that 58% of people feel that they might be more connected to their friends and family as a result of what we're going through at the moment. And I think because we have to think about who we want to connect with, we have to organise that a little bit more. If there is a silver lining, it means that we're connecting with lots of different people that we haven't done previously. Because rather than spending a whole evening with someone and having dinner, you might just drop in for half an hour and have a call. And so I think there is a positive way that technology can bring people together in this, undoubtedly really difficult time.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the silver linings. Really, really interesting. Thank you for that, Ian. So I'd like to flip to one of our audience questions now and invite Harry from the Sympler team to join us. Hi, Harry.
Hi, Alannah. So the first question, I think Ian and Ben, both of you have touched on some silver linings here in terms of togetherness and connection. The question is, how do we continue to capitalize on that as we begin to move on from the necessity of physical distancing?
I don't mind sort of sharing what I'm going to share this a little bit in the stuff we talk about, but I think that people are naturally going to be doing that anyway. I think the sort of the more sort of caring, empathetic, thoughtful, reflective stuff, which I'll talk about in a second, people are already doing it. So I think brands need to recognize that that's going to be there's going to be a slightly slower pace and capitalize it on that way. But I don't think it needs to be forced. I think these last 12 weeks, I think have sort of kind of created some new neural pathways and conditioned us a bit more to stay in that kind of way. That's certainly from what we're hearing from consumers.
Great. Ian, would you like to share anything?
Yeah, no, I think I totally agree with that. I think we've got a sort of a kind of culture that's kind of emerged, and this kind of moving from me to we is definitely something, and that kind of community spirit. So I don't think it's something that needs to be forced at all.
Brilliant. Thanks to whoever shared that question in our audience. I can't see you, but it was a great one. So for the second part of today, we're going to hear about how everyday people around the world are feeling on howdoyoufeel.live. For those that joined last week, you've seen this video already, but for the newbies in the group, we wanted to share it again. And then can you, before you share kind of this week's highlights, can you tell us a bit about what howdoyoufeel.live is and what inspired the team to create it? And there's a video that will play.
Yeah, so Sympler applies a much more human and conversational approach to research. So the point of which is to make organizations more empathetic. So we don't only use messaging apps to make things feel more natural, but we also use chatbots, which are given quite a bad press. But chatbots can actually converse with people in a much more reflective way. They're like a great moderator. So it's less like traditional research. Think more like kind of therapy. So when the coronavirus hit, it forced us inside. And it sort of made us lose touch with strangers from the outside world. So things like empathy, human connection, and info gathering suddenly became a priority. So we thought, why not point our technology at this problem and share the output? So what you're seeing in the background at the moment is us doing that. It's sort of a global map that picks up where people are, what their emotions are based on what they said in the video or in a diary entry. And it really shares the emotional truths, the emotional layer of what people feel. Because people are much more candid. You know, we prompt them in the way that we do things, to, like a therapist does, to sort of go beyond just the sort of what they think to what do they feel, hence the name. And it's been really quite reflective. I'm now going to share sort of a couple of things that came out of that. So the first one is what we're sort of referring to as learned agoraphobia. So as we get into the third month of social distancing, which, you know, a lot of us never thought we'd be here for this long, we're seeing a new phenomenon that really wasn't around in the first few weeks. It's this compounded sense of the longer we stay in, the more reason there is to stay in. So almost like one of those cognitive biases you hear that you're doing for something for so long, so it must be important. So the danger is greater the longer our reaction lasts to it. So the weird thing is that the people, in order to overcome this fear and this sort of sense of anxiety that produces, we then stay in even more because that's become a comfort mechanism. And then that contributes even more to it. And so we have to stay in for longer. So the result is a fear of leaving home that's almost disconnected from the original reason. And the way we pick this up, because we read sort of subtext of the way people are talking, and we saw a lot of people saying, we're not going out again. And actually, we're frightened of going out again. And in some cases, they do have reasons, but in other cases, they give lots of reasons, which kind of leads you to sort of read between the lines that they're finding reasons. So one person said, I feel panic at the mere thought that I can be approached by people. I could be stalked, but with the lockdown, I felt safer. And there's a video for this one.
So as the lockdown restrictions begin to ease, it worries me because I do have a son that has severe asthma and an immune disorder. So what we're doing is we still keep our social distancing. We don't go into stores with the kids just to keep them safe. I think it was too soon.
So she got slightly cut off at the end, but she just finished saying soon. So a lot of people are talking like her with lots of reasons. The second one is we're sort of predicting a slower pace post-opening, like I sort of mentioned earlier. So many people are talking about the discovery of slower, more mindful pursuits like walking, meditating, biking. There's a bunch of reports in the media saying in the bigger cities, there's a fear of congestion after lockdown opens up because everyone's going to be jumping in their cars because they're afraid of public transport. We're actually noticing that perhaps that spike might come on foot and on two wheels. Because while people are forced to walk and pause and stop a lot of activities and do in-home things at the beginning, we're now starting to notice that they're becoming kind of attached to these activities. So people talk about, I'll take walks more, I'm going to be riding my bike more often, spending more time with existing friends, trying to stay fit with Pilates, keeping my mind active, writing stories for people. And there's a video for this one too.
Well, in order to keep myself happy, I started painting, which is really nice. I started looking for new traveling destinations and to know about new countries. I started talking to different people, like I started counseling, which is really helpful. So trying to cook new recipes.
And then the third one was this idea of going from a sense of social to almost physical disgust. So what used to annoy people, be mild annoyances for people like bodily sounds, invasion of personal space and other kind of personal habits, now actually produces a full-blown sense of panic and even rage that people are feeling justified for. So it's always been true that social annoyances are actually closely connected to taste and smell. That's why we use words like disgust when talking about someone. And as a result, they produce similar sorts of reactions. But now those connections are much closer. They're no longer sort of metaphorical connections. So I want to play the final video on this. The guy talks about tasting someone else's breath.
Main habit will probably be keeping my distance from other people, going shopping when it's quiet, and just washing my hands a lot more often, probably wearing a face covering in public as well. I feel like it's better privacy, and the breath transmission as well. Good analogy is you always know when you're near someone who's vaping with like a scented vape, like the guy with a candy floss vape pen. You can smell that thing from 50, 100 feet away. That's because it's his breath you can smell. He breathes it in, and once it goes out again, it'll travel downwind to you. In a marketplace, everyone will get a smell of it, and it could quite easily be coronavirus particles as well that could infect anybody in that crowd. Whilst a mask won't stop that, I think it's an eye-opener as to how easily an airborne disease could be transmitted just like that. So yeah, trying to avoid crowds and going shopping when it's quiet is probably the biggest thing that I'll do.
Thank you for that, Ben. I think for me, what's a real eye-opener is just getting inside people's heads and what they're thinking. And I encourage everyone to go on howdoyoufeel.live and share how you're feeling and discover what other people around the world are feeling. And there's loads of great videos and anecdotes on there. So Ian, reflect upon these insights. Do any of these kind of ring true to what you've been discovering in the Facebook's communities, or what you've been learning about audiences and kind of insights during the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they certainly do. I think, was it tasting someone's breath? I think that took me back to mornings on the tube, which is not the nicest memory. But I think actually, being on a serious note, I think there are two points really resonated with me from that. One was this sense of learned agoraphobia that you talked about up front, Ben, and also in the last clip, this kind of sort of anxiety. I'm not sure exactly why there would be, the reasons for it, and has been created, but this anxiety people are going to have about going back out and getting on with life as it was before, from public transport to going to shops to, socializing. I think as we re-emerge, there's going to be a very gradual shift back to what happened before, if we ever do get back to that. And I think, for the economy to get started, businesses are going to have to think about how they allay some of people's fears in this space. How do they help people who want to have that degree of social distancing have that? How do they allow them to feel comfortable, going into their shops, going into the restaurants, going into the bars again? And it's going to be a really important part of this. And it's not just going to be, this is ended, lockdown's finished, we're back out there. It's a very, very gradual transition. And I think the second part was just a wonderful clip there where the lady was talking about how she's trying lots of new things. She started painting and learning about new countries, and that sort of thirst for knowledge. We've been forced to sort of fill our time, and a lot of people have chosen to do that with rediscovering things they used to love from a long time ago, or learning new skills. We're certainly seeing that on the platform, and we're seeing this both from people. We're also seeing great things from brands leading into this. We were talking earlier on about one of my favourite things was Marc Jacobs, fashion designer. They were doing live drawing called Drawn Together with an artist, ran on Instagram Live, and you could learn sort of painting skills and bringing people together that way. And I guess the final point with that is I think, one of the sectors that is going to get disrupted in, the biggest way is around education. People are learning skills. We've learnt to learn online and remotely. And education has been an incredibly privileged and exclusive part. The best universities in the world cost money to go to. The best schools you have to generally live in the developed world. But this is going to open up and change a lot of that. And I think we're seeing that now, the ability for people to learn online, educate themselves. And I think that's one sector that's going to come out of this in a very different way, in a very positive way as well.
That's lovely, thank you. Ian, I know you've recently hosted the Social Good Conference, and is there kind of anything that you've been talking to the charities that have been attending that in terms of like this kind of opening up of community, and what has your advice been to them?
Yeah, it's a tough one. Actually, we had that earlier today, and we had nearly 1,000 charities join the conference. I'm also vice chair of the Media Trust, and we work with lots of charities on their comms, and so we're very closely tied into that. If anyone listening wants to volunteer some of their time, you can go to the Media Trust site and volunteer your time. And it's very serious for charities. The digital divide is real. And a lot of these charities, because when they get money and funding, quite rightly, that funding wants to go on the front line, and they don't invest in digital infrastructure, and they don't have the technology, the infrastructure, and the skills to be able to navigate this new normal. And I think, that 20 years of digital transformation we've all talked about, you just don't have a choice. If you do not transform your organization, your business to be, digital first, it's going to be hard for you to come through this and survive. And we're particularly seeing this in the charity sector. And, we're seeing a lot of charities very sadly have to close their doors because of what's happening at the moment.
Well, it's great that you're able to support these communities and trying to help guide them as they move forward. So I think it's time for another question from our audience. So Harry, would you like to rejoin us and share what everyone's asking?
Yes. So both of you have talked about how unprecedented this time is, but also how unprecedented the sort of the data and insights. And Ian, you talked about sort of the usage information, and Ben, you've talked about all of the different things you're hearing via how do you feel. The question is, does that mean we essentially have to throw out all of the learnings and the data from before this all started? Or if not, how do we reconcile the two?
Good question, and that's a toughie. Ben, I'm going to hand over to you to start.
I have got quite strong opinions about that, which is I do think that while you certainly don't throw out data, it is a really interesting time for certain types of data that have had years of stability and benchmarks on which you are building your hypotheses for the future. So when you've got, unprecedented change in the way that people are behaving, and they're all suddenly driven, that everything has been upended, and you start to pull the thread on just a few topics, and you realize that even things you hadn't thought about being effective, there's obvious things like travel, but then there's things like creativity, because creativity really thrives in cities, and cities are starting to sort of be, people are moving to the country. So what does that mean for creative hubs? You realize that so much has been changed that you need to start to use data sources and methodologies that are more trained to look forward. And I feel like we've had a sort of generation of tweaking methodologies that kind of take models and go, well, this kind of works, so let's just A/B test it. And I think that era might need to be given a bit of a wake-up call, personally. I've got quite strong opinions on that one, but I don't think it means you throw everything out. It just means you're going to have to bring in more future-focused methodologies. And I think it also requires creative skills for how you design research looking forward a little bit as well. And often big data people don't have creative minds because they're often left brain. So I think you might be seeing some right brain thinkers coming back into data because projective thinking requires a little bit of creativity.
Thank you, Ben. Ian?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I think in terms of taking that sort of measurement approach and planning approach to what's going to stick and what's not, we can all make predictions, but it's quite hard to have a crystal ball and be incredibly precise. What I do think, though, is that business planning for a long time has been, a fundamentally flawed process. We'll go out, we'll do focus groups, we'll ask people what they think, we make loads of predictions, we then go and sink huge amounts of money into producing a business proposition or some marketing communications or some advertising, and we invest, and we've gone all in by the time we get to the point where it hits the real world, and that's been a bad process forever. I think in this new world, what we might see is that people have to iterate more, experiment more. I mean, you know, on social media, on Facebook, you could go live with an idea in a few hours and you could test it. You don't have to spend huge amounts of money. I think, like Ben's saying, you know, speaking to people and finding ways to connect with them digitally to understand what they're doing. Test more, iterate more, and start to see what's working, and then, you know, then double down on those things that are actually working. And I think it might just give the whole planning, the whole research, development kind of industry a real shake-up.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ian, and thank you to our audience for that. So we're now going to move to the final part of today's session, where we're going to look to the future and talk a bit about predictions as we move forward. Ian, the first question's for you. The sudden shift to life on lockdown is and will continue to have a significant impact on people in all kinds of ways, as with any crisis. And we, you know, have yet, as you said, to comprehend the full extent of that impact. And we're still in the lockdown phase, and there's new phases to come. So, you know, you've talked about kind of experimentation and iteration. So what technologies do you believe are going to kind of be instrumental in connecting society after lockdown? Or kind of what innovations are you seeing at the moment? Or what are people trying that you think is exciting, either on Facebook or kind of in the wider marketing landscape?
I mean, that's, yeah, it's again a good question. Just saying I wouldn't be able to predict it. Now I'm going to try and predict a few things that I think will be important. I think, you know, one of the big areas for me is enhancing this kind of experience we're having here. You know, hats off to you and the team. This seems to me, from where I'm sitting, to be going seamlessly, and it's good. But how do we enhance these kind of experiences? At the moment, you know, there's video and we're speaking to each other, but that augmented reality element and being able to sort of, you know, play games in a really immersive way, interact in a really immersive way, you know, have a pub quiz, you know, listen to music, but collectively do that. And, you know, I think there's going to be a lot of innovation around that. Certainly, you know, what we're looking at this very, very heavily, and trying to enhance this kind of experience as people try and sort of connect remotely is definitely one. And then I think the other one, you know, that I'd like to think is going to stick, that we've seen, is around sort of local community. So, you know, community on Facebook groups, you know, go and join the groups for everything you could possibly imagine, every kind of interest you've got. And, you know, one of the big trends that we've seen is people joining local groups to support local communities. So we've seen 2 million people in the UK join more than 2,000 local support groups on Facebook. And those are people coming together to support the people in their area, the more vulnerable people in their area. And, you know, it would be great to think that there is this sort of sense of community spirit. So how do you tap into what's around you, you know, in quite close proximity? So, yeah, two extremes there. One, augmented reality kind of changing how we connect across the world. And then two, how do we get closer to the local communities around us?
Brilliant. Thank you, Ian. Well, Ben, kind of leading on from that, really, we're seeing this reprioritization of values in society right now. And, you know, brands and marketers need to wake up to this change. You know, what's your advice on kind of what do you think is going to be important as organizations rethink their strategies moving forward? You know, what are the kind of the top priorities they need to focus on, would you say? You know, last week you spoke a lot about things like how millennials are starting to save like they never did before, God forbid, and, you know, what that means for, you know, their spending habits. So I'd be interested to hear what you think about what brands and marketeers should be doing and focusing on.
Yeah, I actually want to pick up on what Ian said about closeness between consumers. We are seeing a lot of like much more, you know, even from like hermits, you know, on our last week talked about people are coming out to clap for the NHS that never really liked that communal stuff, and people are getting into their local communities in a much better way. And I think that same rule is going to apply to marketers, which is, you know, we're already seeing from the data that we're looking into here and the conversations we're having that people are a lot less patient for tone deaf marketers. They always were, but they had so many other things going on in their lives. They could get away with it. A marketer bleating in the background, shouting about things that they didn't understand. They just move on. But right now, there are these moments where you've got their attention a bit more. So you could really, it's yours to lose, basically, at this point. So I think, you know, everyone's had to make changes. And marketers who aren't really quick to empathize with those changes, I think are going to lose out really quickly. Because there's other ones that are jumping in and taking advantage of it and going, and sort of quietening it down and whispering and saying, look, we're in there. You know, don't say we're in this together like a million different marketers are saying in commercials. Act it out. And, you know, empathy keeps coming up. You know, we're already in the empathy business. So we're already talking about this and we hear that word already. But I'm noticing it growing exponentially. There's people talking about this word that you would never expect to even know its meaning. You know, George W. Bush came out with a video the other day where he used that word at least twice. Elon Musk has used it. And the police the other night. You're like, these are not places where you expect that word to come up. So if these guys are using it, then marketers need to be delivering it as well.
Great. Ian, so you work with some major global advertisers who are activating in local communities and on a global scale with their campaign planning. Have you experienced any major challenges since the lockdown that you've been working through with clients? Or, you know, have there been, what are the highlights and the developments on the positive side you can pick?
Yeah, I mean, every single business has been affected by this. God, where to start with that? I mean, this is an unusual. It's an unusual recession or unique recession in a way that it wasn't one that was driven by consumer demand to start with. It's been driven by distribution, and for most people, it's been the ability to get your product into the consumer's hands. It's been a really huge challenge, and I think for big CPG advertisers, historically, often what's happened, and P&Gs and Unilevers of this world have actually spent their way through recessions. They've capitalised on cheaper media costs and they've invested to increase their share of voice, and that's translated to an increase of share market. But businesses have a real challenge that they're marketing, and often they can't distribute their product. So it's a really complex balance to protect your brand, to protect that demand. But if you can't fulfill it, should you be spending at that particular point? The biggest question I get without a shadow of a doubt is around e-commerce. The new shop front is digital and mobile, and how do advertisers pivot really quickly into this space? Machine learning, I was talking to you about this earlier on, machine learning, artificial intelligence, automation, these are going to be the engines of growth as we move into this. And sort of signals-based marketing is a real challenge, collecting the right signals so you're delivering the right product back to people. And then I guess the final point, I think, from a brand perspective, I think empathy is really interesting. And people care what brands are doing. There's a great website which is called didtheyhelpus.com.
Yeah, that's great. I've actually shown that website to a client of mine when we were talking about a response to COVID and showing where they tracked on that website.
It's amazing. Yeah, and I mean, it's a great thing. People care like what brands are doing and how you stand up and have a perspective on this. And I think if you get that right, you've got an opportunity to build a uniquely strong bond with your customers that will last not just weeks and months, but can last for a really long time. My grandparents shopped their entire life at M&S because of the way that M&S, Marks and Spencer's as it was, supported local communities during the Second World War and the Blitz in London. And they stuck with them for 50 years. And I'm not saying it's exactly like that today, but if brands get it right, you can build a very unique bond with customers.
Brilliant. So we're nearly out of time, and I actually want to see if we've got another question from our audience. So Harry, would you like to join us again and share one final question with Ben and Ian?
Sure, yeah. I think this one is harkens back or was triggered by the insight about physical disgust. But the question is, what does empathy look like, particularly on a personal basis, in a world where we are, we are a threat to one another and we are feeling that, understandable personal disgust?
Wow, that's a really good point because it does sort of contradict. One of the things that we've been hearing a lot in the news, even though the media is trying to force the opposite of this, is that this isn't actually down party lines, or it's not a red-blue division. That actually this is about personal fears and personal kind of anxieties. So I definitely think that. There's a sort of thing that every human can do to just think about individuals rather than big groups of people, because this is no longer government versus us. It's no longer Democrats versus conservatives. So I feel like there is a sort of, well, you know, a lot of what we're talking about is helping brands be more empathetic. I do see it being split down the middle between people who are just really frightened of everybody else, and they've sort of lost a little bit of their empathy. And there's the other people who are kind of like going, I just need to get out into the world. You know, all those people who volunteered for the NHS in the UK who are like, we'll do it. So I do actually think there's a separation, although it's not down party lines, there is a separation down kind of personal fear, freedom, disgust lines. That is actually exposing it. And I hadn't really thought about it before. You're right. It's just like the people you weren't expecting are becoming more empathetic, and people who were empathetic before are actually becoming so frightened they're losing their ability to realize that everyone actually is in this together. So yeah, it's a good point. And I'm not sure that was an answer, more of a sort of good point.
Thank you, Ben. Ian, final comments from you.
Just general closing comments, or?
Well, in response to the question, or any kind of reflections that you'd like to share and kind of learnings you've had during this time, pick.
Well, yeah, just in terms of closing reflections, and you know, I think this understanding of people in this, you know, we're talking about insight today, and this is going to be critically important going forward. And I think, you know, thinking really carefully about how you can understand your audience, understand what they're connecting with, and what matters to them is going to be really, really important. And it's not, you know, I think we've got to remember that this isn't a brief, this is a pandemic. And it's, you know, you've got to approach it with that mindset. We need to, you know, businesses and people and companies like Facebook, we need to be in this to help solve this problem. It is not an opportunity to market to people. It is an opportunity to help. Remembering that it's a pandemic, not a brief, I think is very useful. It's something very useful to bear in mind.
Thank you, Ian. I think that was the perfect roundup. Go on, Ben.
I got one. It's a really good point. The questions, because it's not a brief. It's a very different scenario. It's actually sparked very different kinds of briefs, and I've never seen in 20 years the types of questions people have. They're so much more existential. They're like, who the hell are we right now? Where are we going? Which way is up? Which way is down? And what are people going to do? Those are kind of big philosophical, meaty questions. They don't feel like traditional briefs. So I think you're seeing that already out there, it's got very existential and philosophical, which I think is a good thing in a lot of ways.
Let's hope it lasts. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ian. And thank you, Harry, for joining us today. It's been great having you on. We'll see you soon. And thank you to our audience. Your questions were brilliant. I hope you found today inspiring. And thank you to our wider team as well, who helped produce these talks today. So please do have a look on howdoyoufeel.live and discover how audiences around the world are feeling. And all that's left to say is thank you from myself and the team at How Do You Feel. See you soon and stay safe.